Financial Wellness Hour. I am your host, Hirsch Serman, and I am thrilled to have you join us today here on WGSN-DB, the Going Solo Network. This show is for those wanting to create financial wellness, and we're going to be looking at different life cycles and explore them financially and emotionally, because personal finances are actually more about the emotions associated with your money than the finances themselves. And the healthier we are emotionally, the more prepared we are to make sound financial decisions. We want to make this relevant and personal, so please do reach out to us. You can reach me through my website, lifecycle.financial. That's lifecycle.financial, or you can post your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube, or anywhere else you might be listening to this. A quick PSA for everybody in the US. Today is April 4th. It is exactly 2 weeks till the filing deadline for your taxes. I would say if you are worried you're not going to make the deadline, please go to my blogs. I have a blog that I just put out there a week ago about what happens if I'm not going to make the deadline. So please do look that up. It's a pretty simple fix and you can move on and de-stress. And talking about stress, going through a divorce is a difficult process and a difficult time. And as people go through the process, they realize there are many moving parts. It's kids and schedules and maintenance. And what are we going to do with the house and transferring the assets and learning a new family dynamic and even more. As you are taking care of so much, your attorney is taking care of a myriad of items as well that he or she has to do. And sometimes this includes interacting and communicating with other professionals and even opposing counsel. I have a lot of clients that are asking me, is that a normal thing? My attorney speaks to the opposing attorney, and that is a resounding yes. You'd be amazed at what all your attorney actually does for you. And we will explore that more later on this show. So the one big question this leaves is, who is your attorney speaking to? And what is going on behind the scenes? This is a great question, and I do encourage you to know more about it. So to help us navigate this and understand more is Kelly Collins. She is the founder of Collins Family Law in Chicago. I've known Kelly for a while. We've worked on a couple different conferences together. She brings a wealth of knowledge and experience. She is the chair of Lake County's Bar Association, the family law section. I've mentioned Divorce University on the show, and she is our fearless leader. She is actually the one that drives it all, puts it together, and has been published. And Kelly, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you, Hirsch. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we have lots we're going to cover, I know, because I know there is a lot that you do, and we're going to try to cover as much as we can. So before we kind of just dive in, I'm going to ask people, it's easy for me to say you have a wealth of knowledge, but you have 20 plus years experience. Can you just share a little bit of your background so that people really understand that?
Of course. I have been in private practice since 2005, practicing exclusively in the area of family law. Prior to that, I was a prosecutor for many years at the Lake County State's Attorney's Office and the Illinois Attorney General's Office. In 2010, I went out on my own and started my own practice. And my current practice is Collins Family Law in Lake Forest, Illinois. I have two partners, Sheila and Karen, and we practice primarily in Lake County, Illinois, but we also do some cases in Cook County, Illinois, and some of the other collar counties. And we handle all aspects of family law, the majority of which is divorce.
So it's obviously important people understand who they're hearing from. It's also important for the person going through the divorce, the client, to understand the divorce process. And I'm going to ask you to share a little bit about preparing a client for the process, helping them, because they also need to understand what to expect and what's going to come their way. So can you share a little bit about that?
Absolutely. It's very important to educate the client about the process. As you mentioned earlier, divorce can be overwhelming, and it impacts so many areas of a client's life, where they're going to live, the time they're going to have with their children, what their financial outlook is. Will they be paying maintenance or receiving maintenance and child support? And so it can really be a daunting process for the client. And it helps to educate them on all of these issues. In fact, it's essential to educate them on all of these issues. And knowledge is power. And I can't tell you how many clients feel so much better at the end of a consultation when you talk to them about these issues. And oftentimes when they come in, they sometimes just don't know what the law is and what the likely outcome is. And other times they've been fed misinformation from their spouse or from other people. And they're very worried, they're very scared. And once they're educated about the process, they are feeling much more empowered and ready to navigate their way through the divorce process. And another important thing to remember is it's important at the beginning to educate your client, give them a roadmap, answer any questions they have. But that education doesn't stop there, because this is a long process and nobody knows what issues are going to arise throughout the process. And there are court hearings that can be involved. There are depositions. And oftentimes clients come to me if they've had another attorney where they feel like they're in the dark and they don't know what to expect. They didn't know that they had a court hearing coming up where they had to testify, or they didn't know what to expect in a deposition. And so it's really crucial throughout the process to maintain that close communication with the client and to prepare them so that they know if they're going into court, whether or not they're going to have to testify, what to expect, what the outcomes may be. So it's really important to educate the client and keep them informed, and really understand that every divorce case is unique. These aren't cookie cutter cases. So it's also important to listen to your client and understand what their individual needs and goals are throughout the process in order to achieve the best result possible for your client.
So much. I wish I had got all of that down, because I want to dissect some of that. Number one is you said, and this resonates with me so strongly because I am so aligned in the way that I do that. Education is enormous. And going out on the internet, you have to be so careful. There's amazing information out there, but you got to make sure it applies to you. I had a client, and I've said this on the show before, they came to me and started talking about, well, I'm legally separated because and I said, well, you live in Texas. It's the only state that does not have legal separation that's recognized. Blew everything up. You really do need to understand what applies to you and how, and that's where someone like yourself becomes so important. Number two is just they don't know. And sometimes it's even they don't know who they are anymore. And being able to say to them, look, there are decisions you're going to have to make. I'm not going to make it. The attorney's not going to make it. Sometimes the judge will, depending if it goes there. But sometimes just the fact that they know and they can start to think through, well, what do I want? What are my priorities and my values? When it comes time to make those decisions, I think that becomes an enormous piece of this as well. And you mentioned it's not a cookie cutter. I tell people this is not a linear process. Very similar thought to what you're saying. It can veer off in many directions and it can come back to where it was and then, go back out. So due to this dynamic process, if I can call it that, what are some of the areas that you actually end up, if you can go a little bit more granular, maybe in where you actually educate and prepare your clients, and what are the things that you might be discussing with them?
Sure, absolutely. On the financial side of things, we will talk about issues such as what the client can expect to receive or pay in maintenance. Maintenance is what the term we currently use for spousal support. It was formerly called alimony. And sometimes clients will come in and they think that they aren't going to get any maintenance, and they're afraid to move forward because they think that if they go through with the divorce, they'll be destitute. And oftentimes the spouse who would have to pay them maintenance is telling them that they're going to be destitute if they go through with the divorce. So it's very important to discuss the issue of spousal support, both with a client who may be receiving it and also with the client who may be paying it, because that can impact your other financial issues as well, and whether or not you can afford to stay in the home, or if you're moving, what you can afford. And so we talk about maintenance, we talk about child support. And child support is also something that by statute parties have to pay or they are entitled to, and that obligation or receiving that will also impact their overall financial picture. And there are laws that govern this. So even if we don't have the exact income of each party, we can at least give them a ballpark estimate and say, well, it's very likely that you're going to have to be paying maintenance, and under the law, you'll be paying maintenance for this number of years. So they can have, at least they can project and figure out, okay, what's this going to look like for me for many years going forward. We also talk about issues like division of assets, and oftentimes clients feel like if there's retirement accounts that have accrued during the marriage, but it's only in one spouse's name, they don't think they're entitled to any of that. And that's not the law. It's marital property regardless of whether it's in the name of one spouse or the other. So it's important to educate them on how the law determines what marital assets they're entitled to. And if there are non-marital assets, such as an inheritance that they've kept separate, that they don't have to divvy that up as part of the marital settlement. They keep that as their sole property. And likewise, we talk about debts. There are marital debts, there are non-marital debts. And so it's important to get into all of these areas in order to at least give somewhat of a financial picture to your client of what their finances are going to look like after the divorce. And oftentimes they leave feeling much better because they didn't realize they would get half of the retirement accounts. They didn't realize they would get maintenance for many years. So, and on the flip side, sometimes they don't like the fact that they have to pay maintenance and divide up their hard-earned retirement because they were the one that was working and earned it. But that's a reality check you have to have with your client to manage their expectations. So we talk about the financial side of things, and we also talk, if there are minor children involved, it's very important to discuss the parenting issues, which include parenting time, what's realistic to expect regarding whether or not you're going to have the majority of parenting time, what kind of parenting time will your spouse have, and sometimes they think, oh, he shouldn't have much time at all. And then in talking to them, it is apparent that there's really no legal basis to deny them parenting time. So you have to talk with your client and manage their expectations about whether or not their spouse is going to have a lot of parenting time. Other issues come up too, such as staying in the house and whether or not you're going to have enough assets to buy your spouse out of the house, and if that makes financial sense. And then there are also issues regarding a spouse who may want to move out of state or move far away, even if it's not out of state. And sometimes they think that that's an easy thing to do and that they have the right to do that. And that's not the case under the law. So there are just so many areas where you need to have an in-depth and thoughtful discussion with your client about these issues.
And I think this comes back a lot to what you said earlier about that everyone is unique and every divorce is unique, because what you mentioned may only, not everything's going to apply to everybody. And, the one thing I always tell people is when they talk about things, I say, well, you've heard this from your spouse. There is the spouse versus the reality. And those can be very, very different. If your spouse is the one that has to pay or give up, so to speak, assets, yes, they're going to tell you you're going to get nothing, or they're going to minimize what you're going to get. I've had clients that have said, well, I've never worked a day of our marriage, so he told me I don't deserve, or I'm not going to get any. And I always try to put a non-dollar value to what people bring. If they went out and got a job, they might, you got 2 or 3 kids, you might be spending 40, 50, 60,000 in daycare, because daycare is not cheap. There's the reality of most retirement accounts can only be in one name. But how did that person succeed in their role? Because you cleared the way for them, or whatever it might be, right? The maintenance one is a big one as well, with, the person, spouse who might have to pay throws out a number, and it's a third of what the reality or what the law may even state. Some states don't have a formula. In Illinois, it's very fortunate. There's a formula that can be followed for the most part for most people. It doesn't mean you can't negotiate or deviate from that, but it gives you a guideline that a lot of states don't. There's so many things that need to really be understood. And inevitably, I think, we put a tremendous amount of faith in our attorney, which is important. They are not the sole professional or expertise that might be needed. Inevitably, you, Kelly, as an attorney, will speak with other professionals, which I think is important for people to understand. It might happen in the presence of the client. It may not happen in the presence of the client, and those conversations may be happening kind of behind the scenes. Who are some of the professionals, just to give a feel, who are some of the professionals you might be leaning on or interacting with as you go through a process?
That is a great question. And there are a myriad of different professionals that I deal with when a client is getting divorced. And it varies, as you noted, depending on the case and the particular issues. But financial planners are a big one. If I have a client and she wants to figure out what she can afford and what her financial future is going to look like, and we have at least a general idea of what she's going to, for example, be receiving in maintenance and child support and what marital assets she's going to be receiving, then I often refer the client to a financial planner, and then the financial planner will do some projections into the future. And that can be very helpful for a client to help make the client make decisions in the divorce. For example, what I had mentioned earlier about, does it make sense to keep the house if I have to buy my spouse out of his interest in the home and maybe get less in retirement assets? Then how will that impact my future? Is that a financially prudent decision? And that's just one example of how a financial planner can be helpful in helping clients make decisions in terms of their financial future.
And I want to touch on the house, because this is the classic example, right? And I actually, on many of my clients, spend an entire session, sometimes two, walking them through the finances of keeping the home, not keeping the home. And the ones that sometimes come up or commonly come up, that I don't want to go through everything. The two that commonly come up is somebody will say to me, well, I've got kids in high school and I want to wait 2 years or 3 years till they're out of high school, then I'll sell the house. Okay, that's one classic. And there's two major pieces, just to give the people listening a feel of the depth of what you sometimes need guidance on. The house, when you sell it, on average has about an 8% cost, 6% in your real estate commissions, and roughly 2% on other closing costs. I'm going to make it easy. I'm going to take $1 million home. That's $80,000. If you take the home and sell it 18 months, 2 years later, you have to absorb the full $80,000 in those costs. That's one. As opposed to if you sell it when you're married, it's, so to speak, $40,000 each. That's number one. Number two, on the home, in a scenario like that, or any scenario, you got your $1 million home. Let's make it easy and say you bought it for $500,000. There is an exclusion in the capital gain if you're married, of $500,000. You don't pay any capital gains tax. Well, what happens if you sell the home and now you've had it for 2 years, you're single, you only get $250,000. All of a sudden, you've got a capital gains tax on $250,000 you weren't expecting either. So you've got your capital gains tax on $250,000, you got another $40,000 on the closing costs, and all of a sudden you've spent, $100,000 you didn't think was going to be spent, and you bought him out at full price, or her out at full price. These are some of the things that people really should be understanding and walk through. And just because you can afford it, by the way, still doesn't mean it's the right decision. So just a few things.
And that's why I would send my clients to someone like you who has all of that knowledge.
Yeah, it's a big one. And, even the hour conversation is really worth knowing what your options are. So one of them I know that you're going to be speaking to is going to be a guardian ad litem, and I think, or GAL, as a lot of people call them. Can you talk a little bit more about that professional in the process? Because they are a fairly integral process when it comes to kids. But at the same time, I really don't think people fully understand the impact or the role of a GAL.
Sure. Guardian ad litems are attorneys that have expertise in issues pertaining to parenting and children, and they are often appointed by the court in cases where there are minor children and the parents are unable to agree on the parenting issues in the divorce, whether that has to do with parenting time, decision-making authority, or other concerns regarding parental conduct. Sometimes there are concerns about substance abuse or mental health problems. And sometimes you also have children who have special needs or issues where they need the investigation of a guardian ad litem. So in those types of cases, the court will appoint a guardian ad litem or a child representative. They're very similar roles. But as a guardian ad litem, and I'm a guardian ad litem as well, I do guardian ad litem work. The job of the guardian ad litem is to investigate those issues, and to that end, the guardian ad litem will speak to the parents. The guardian ad litem will speak to the children. The guardian ad litem does home visits. The guardian ad litem will speak to other witnesses that may have helpful information about whatever issues are of concern in that case. Oftentimes it will be speaking to teachers or therapists that are treating the children or the parents. Sometimes there are neighbors that are involved and family members. So the guardian ad litem looks into all of these issues, and then the guardian ad litem, after they conduct their investigation, will make recommendations about things like parenting time and decision making, or if mental health is an issue and the guardian ad litem feels that a parent or a child needs the support of a therapist, a guardian ad litem can recommend individual therapy for the parents or the children, and also family therapy. The guardian ad litem can also recommend communication or co-parenting therapy for the parents if there's a high level of conflict and they have difficulty communicating with each other and making decisions about their kids together. So, and then the guardian ad litem will make these recommendations to the judge, and the judge will take them into consideration in making his or her ruling about these parenting issues.
And some of the things, just from my perspective, that I've appreciated as I've been working in this over the years, I look at this and I often see where you might have, whether it's a 5 or 15-year-old or anywhere in between, they don't want to take sides. These are their parents. They want both their parents. They don't want to upset one of the parents. Sometimes they're not even sure how to express themselves. The guardian ad litem comes in and can be an objective third party and almost give a voice to the child without putting the child in the middle of everything. And that's something that I actually really appreciate when it comes to the work that you do in that area of the divorce process. Any quick follow-up on that, or should we go to a break and come back?
A quick follow-up, because I think that's a really important point. Children often get caught in the crossfire of divorce. They feel caught in the middle, and they feel torn and feel like if they say something negative about one parent, they're betraying that parent. And the guardian ad litem can be very useful, one, in talking to the kids and getting that information, and where the kids feel usually pretty safe talking to the guardian ad litem. And then that also eliminates the need for children to be dragged into court, which is a terrible thing. And so the guardian ad litem can tell the judge, this is what the child said. These are my thoughts and concerns about this child. And so the guardian ad litem also serves as a shield for the children while being able to communicate what they've said to the court.
And I'm just going to throw this out quickly. If you, as somebody going through a divorce, think that you have lost a lot of power or your voice, think how much more so the child does, because they are not even part of the process. They are just kind of a side piece that is managed as it goes through. And if you're feeling powerless, you can imagine what the children are feeling. Kelly, we do have to go to a break. We've been running this section a little long, which is great, because that means we've had good stuff to share. But before we do, can you share, how can people get in touch with you and learn more about you, your practice, and how you can help them?
Of course. My website is collinsfamilylawllc.com. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me directly, I can be reached on my email, which is kcollins@collins, collinsfamilylawllc.com, and that's KCOLLINS at collinsfamilylawllc.com.
Thank you. That's great. We will be back in about 2 minutes. We're just going to pay some bills.
Thank you, Hirsch.
Hi, I'm John Thomas. I want to share with you a professional products and services directory we call Going Solo Directory, and you need to check this out. If you want exposure to your business or are seeking professional product or services, this directory has it all. And that membership, for the many special features, you get the benefit of a worldwide exposure with a 40-minute video interview on an international business show showcase. All this for just one low annual fee. For more information, contact GoingSoloDirectory.com.
We are back, and I, as I do every week, want to just recap some of the show, and I do need my glasses because I cannot read what I was writing as we were speaking. There was so much. But we are on WGSN-DB, the Going Solo Network, and we are talking about divorce behind the scenes and what all happens. Kelly Collins is the guest today. She is the founder of Collins Family Law, and that is collinsfamilylawllc.com. And they are based out of the Chicagoland area. But we spoke about how dynamic this process is. And I think that's something people really need to understand. You don't file and hear the 4 steps and then you're done, right? This is a human process that has a legal document at the end. So I think that is an important thing to remember. And know that this can veer in a lot of different directions. Get educated, work as a team. I think other things that brought up that were of interest were what your spouse says versus the reality of the situation, dividing the assets, the title of accounts, and how that can be a shared account, even though it's not in your name. We spoke a little bit about the complexities of the house. That does mean there are other areas that have complexities as well. And we spoke about the other professional, or some of them. We didn't even touch on most of them. We just covered a few of them that might be brought into the process in order to help us as we go through. And then the other piece was the education and the expectations. And one of the things I think also that we said, or was at least alluded to, I don't know that we were direct about it, was the reality and being realistic of your situation. You know, you can't say, I want 50-50 on the kids, but hey, you know what? You travel 65% of the time for work. You can't say things like, I want 90% of the assets, when realistically that's just not going to happen. And you would rather make the decision by being realistic and having that negotiation than going to court. This is my opinion anyway. And having somebody else being the judge look at the 2 cases and say, you know what? I think this, and I'm going to make a decision for you. And you don't know what their personal biases are. They are people, and they come with their own pieces as well, which I think are very, very important as well. One of the things I think that resides through all of this, whether it's the education, whether it's the expectations, whether it's whatever it is talking about communication a little bit. We did speak that there's communication behind the scenes with other professionals, but after working with so many clients and seeing some of the things, I think one of the disconnects that sometimes happens is not understanding how to work with your attorney effectively. You know, for example, I want my attorney to know everything about my case because they're my advocate. Well, calling them 3 times a day may not be helpful. It may actually hinder the attorney's effectiveness. How do we manage expectations? How should the client sometimes be managing their own expectations?
Great question. With regard to communication, I have clients that are on both ends of the spectrum. Sometimes they email me 10 times a day, and I tell them, try to hold your thoughts. And if it's something that's of an emergency nature, of course, let me know right away. But compile all of your concerns into one email and send me one email a day or one email every 2 days, because it's just not efficient. And it gets expensive for the client. If I'm spending my day reading, I had a client yesterday that sent me 24 emails. And so it's important to tell your client, just advise them on how they can limit their communication while at the same time feeling like they're conveying what they need to convey to me. And of course, I want to listen and I want to help them, but being barraged by multiple emails a day, it's just not the best way of doing things. On the other side of the spectrum, I have clients that put their head in the sand, and that is to some extent understandable because divorce can be an unpleasant process, and some people react by just trying to ignore it, and they will not return my communications, or they'll return it a week later after an issue that was already needed to be addressed several days ago. And that's not helpful. And oftentimes they will also not report things to me that I needed to know, like, oh, he withdrew $100,000 from that account last month. So it's important to let them know what you need to know, the types of things that they should be communicating about, and the types of little things that maybe can wait. So it is important to manage their communication. And, sometimes this is just such an overwhelming process for them. It's very emotional, and they sometimes identify with me more on a therapist level, because we're communicating about all these issues, and they will communicate about things where I'm not a therapist, and it's more appropriate for them to be dealing with the emotional side of the divorce with a therapist. So that's another way of helping a client and managing the communication end of things, because I obviously care very much about my clients, and I sympathize for the difficulty they're going through, but I'm the attorney, and my job is to communicate with and advocate for them on the legal issues. So if I recognize that a client is kind of venting to me on a regular basis about emotional issues, I will tell them, it would be really helpful for you to have a therapist to help you navigate your way through these emotional issues. And it's often very helpful when they have the support of a therapist.
I agree. I'll often say to my clients, it sounds counterintuitive, but adding people to your team actually gets you a better result at a lower price, because I'm not a therapist. So to spend an hour with me as a therapist, and I'm sure you feel the same way, you're going to pay my fee, but at the same time, you haven't necessarily resolved what you wanted to resolve. Now you got to go see your therapist. So you're going to double pay for the same conversation. And I joke with my clients, it's certainly not true, but I tell them, wait, you're speaking to a cold, heartless MBA, CPA, CDFA here. I'm not the right guy for this, right? And I say that kind of tongue in cheek, because I think I am quite compassionate, and I've been through a divorce. I understand the challenges, not that mine is exactly the same as everyone else's, but I at least understand it. But I think one of the takeaways from what we're saying here is, I'm trying to formulate that thought properly, but there's a fine line between communicating effectively and stalling the process. And that could be on either side, a barrage of communications or lack of communication, right? So effective communication could go either way. It's okay for your priorities to change. I said I wanted this, but when I really think about it, this is more important to me. That is important, and it's important gets communicated. But I like that you said, think it through, put all your thoughts together, and let's communicate and address everything, as opposed to the stalling and starting and stalling and starting in a process of the one-offs. I think that becomes a very effective way to be able to communicate with people. I agree with that.
Good.
And I think, one of the topics we have to speak about is discovery. And I think there's a lot of that in this. Effective communication. Sometimes I've often had people apologize, or I'm embarrassed because I just let him or her take over the finances. I have no idea what we really have. And I think one of the things I guide clients on is, well, just think about mail, think about discussions, think about, anything. Get me a tax return. It's often on there, what accounts there might be. Just write them down. Start, but the discovery process is a very important component of the divorce process. And to fill out the financial affidavit is one piece of the information we need to gather. The year's worth of documents you might be gathering or need to find and understand, and then to review it and understand what the other side has sent and does it look complete and what is missing, and sometimes a forensic review. And there's a lot to that process, and I don't think people always take it as seriously as they should, or on the other side may play games in order to stall the process or make the process more difficult. Share a little bit, if you would, about the importance of being thorough, the step of the process, how it fits in, and why it's so important sometimes as a springboard for other pieces of the divorce for you to have this process done in a complete and thorough manner.
Sure. Discovery is incredibly important. And you mentioned that sometimes a client will not have handled the finances and doesn't have access to financial records. And oftentimes they feel powerless as they enter the divorce process because they know nothing about the family finances. And they also often say, I don't have access to any of those records. How are we going to do this? And then when you explain the discovery process to them, they are very relieved, because the discovery process requires each party to produce financial documents that are in their possession or that they can reasonably be expected to obtain, even if they're not in their possession. And that includes everything from investment account statements, retirement account statements, bank account statements, credit card statements, information regarding a business, if there's a business involved. And it can involve non-financial things as well. But there are specific formal requests that we issue asking for all of these documents, and then the other side has a period of time to respond, and then you get all of these documents. And so it's not only important to obviously obtain the documents that you need in order to understand the financial picture of this family, but it's also important to thoroughly review them. And sometimes discovery, it's often a problem where one side will not respond in a timely manner, or even if they do respond, you get maybe half of what you were asking for. Right. So that's why it's so important to review and to follow up, because you need to, if you haven't received everything, you need to send out what's called a 201k letter saying, okay, I'm missing these various documents. Please provide them within so many days. And sometimes even that doesn't get the other side to provide the information that they need to, in which case you have to file a motion to compel discovery, and that gets brought before the judge, and the judge will enter an order and possibly sanction the other side for their failure to comply with discovery.
Or they drop 300 documents on you the day that it's due.
Right, that's always
There's fun. A lot of games that can be played, and that's another reason I think having a competent and experienced attorney leading the charge is so important. And you don't have to always know everything about the finances to be able to highlight things. I'll give you an example. Is I was dealing with a client, and I said, through the conversation, you've mentioned he's a teacher. She said, yes. And we explored that. He actually was a principal of a high school, and he had been in the school system for about 22, 23 years. I don't remember exactly. And it ended up that he didn't even know he had his regular 403B, which is their pension plan. He had a pension plan funded by the state he didn't even know about. It ended up being another $48,000 that they split evenly between the two of them. It was an extra $2,000 a month for them. So the thoughts and just knowing what's going on and being present and communicating effectively, as we spoke earlier, becomes very important. I also want to touch on what you just said, because these are things that happen behind the scenes that you don't know about as a client, is the tracking of all that discovery and having somebody who's organized and knowing what they're doing with that, and the follow-up and the 201k letter and the going to the judge and all of these pieces you may not even know are happening sometimes, but it's somebody advocating in your behalf. And so being able to understand these things, I think, become very, very important, because sometimes people say, I was charged too much. Sometimes people say they had conversations without me. This is happening for your benefit, not to, to throw you under the bus or to hide anything from you. And I think sometimes clients aren't always aware of that as well. So I do want to ask one more quick kind of question, because we do have to start wrapping up. The question I'm going to ask you, and this is a little different, but it's, I think, a good way to wrap up a lot of what we've spoken about. How do people kind of protect themselves, and what are some of the mistakes that when you see it happening, you're like, I've got to deal with this, it's going to take time, money? What are some of the things that people really need to avoid, or how do they protect themselves from making those mistakes?
Well, one of the major concerns I have is when clients start to negotiate the divorce without the attorneys directly with their spouse. And so, and it happens a lot. And they will say, well, we talked about this and I agreed to take 40% of this asset, or I agreed that I would take less maintenance. And oftentimes there's power imbalance between spouses. So one spouse can exercise undue influence on the other and get them to agree to things that are not in their best interest. And they're entitled to more under the law. And so when those types of conversations take place where the spouses are negotiating directly, then a client may come back to me and say, oh, yes, I agreed to A, B, and C. And I tell them, oh, you shouldn't have agreed to that. You're entitled to much more. And then it's not binding what they've agreed to, but they've already created an expectation with the other spouse. And then it's just extra work trying to undo that and saying, no, we're not honoring that. So that's one area where I would tell them to be very careful. Another area is just to remember the social media is obviously everywhere.
Oh, yes.
And oftentimes, so often it comes up where a spouse has posted something inappropriate on social media, whether they are bashing their other spouse or whether they are doing something inappropriate. And these are all issues that can come into play and be used in court against them. So I tell them to be very mindful about what they post on social media, about themselves, and also avoid saying that it doesn't benefit them to bash their spouse on social media, let alone the impact that could have on children if they see it. So I always have a conversation with them about being very cognizant of how they use social media, what they post on social media. So that's another big area of concern.
So I want to come back to your first piece, and then we do have to kind of wrap up. But the idea that if you are negotiating with your spouse and they pressure you to make a decision right there, that could be a red flag that they're hiding something, or they know that you're entitled to more. And it's not an unreasonable thing to say to somebody, these are big decisions. I'd like 24 hours. I'd like 48 hours to come back. If they really pressure you, then that's a big red flag, in my opinion. So just think about that as well as you go through. And we've covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. And I'm just thinking as we're talking, there really is so much that needs to be thought through and addressed. I think starting with your values and re-identifying, because sometimes you've lost who you are in your divorce. We're dealing with people. We're not dealing with some Six Sigma standardized process for widgets, right? This is where Kelly becomes so important in helping you wrap things up, and that I don't want to say neatly have a bow on it, but you're not back in court 6 months later because you didn't adequately address something. So I think these are so, so important. Kelly, once more, before we wrap up, can you share how can people reach out to you, learn more, and get in touch for your services?
Yes, of course. My website is collinsfamilylawllc.com, and that's Collins, Collins. And my email address is kcollins@collinsfamilyLawLLC.com.
I encourage everyone to reach out. As you've heard, the breadth of what we covered, and we just touched the surface on many things. Kelly can certainly take you through so much more than we did today. I am Hirsch Serman, the host of the Financial Wellness Hour, and I am happy that you joined us. Please reach out to me on my website, lifecycle.financial. That's lifecycle.financial, whether you have questions for me or for Kelly, our guest today. As always, Cece, thank you so much for producing the show and doing everything behind the scenes. No pun intended with our title today. And I look forward to everybody joining me on my next show. And reach out if you have tax questions. Have a wonderful week. Kelly, thank you again. Appreciate everything you do.
Thank you.